Good morning, everyone. We're just letting people in and we'll just start in about half a minute, so just bear with us. Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's conference, Green Infrastructure from Local Innovation to National Transformation. I'm Fiona Howie. I'm the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm delighted to be chairing our first session today. Since the new government came into power in the summer, I'm sure many of you will agree it's been a busy time. Promptly after his appointment as the new Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reed unveiled 5 core priorities for his department: to clean up rivers, lakes and seas, to create a roadmap to move Britain to a zero waste economy, to boost food security, to ensure nature's recovery, and to protect communities from the dangers of flooding. And securing and managing high quality green and blue infrastructure will play a crucial role in whether or not those priorities are achieved. But we're also very mindful that DEFRA is not the lead department for all of the policy levers relevant to achieving those priorities. You'll be unsurprised to know that the TCPA is clear about the transformational role the planning system can and should play in relation to those priorities, but the policy framework's not enabling it, in our opinion, to maximise that role. Over the weekend, we know that the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government said that we need a process that protects nature and wildlife, but not at the expense of building the houses we need. So it'll be interesting to see if there are relevant changes in the update to the National Planning Policy Framework, which we expect to see pretty soon. And later this morning, of course, in other sessions, we'll also consider the still relatively new biodiversity net gain requirements and how those are working. So lots to discuss in the next 2.5 hours, lots to cram in. Next slide, please, Jen. I know many of our audience next slide, please, Jen. Many of our audience are well aware of the TCPA and may have been to one of our conferences before, so I won't spend too long introducing us, but I did want to take a moment to highlight that we're a charity that works to challenge, inspire and support people to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair for everyone. And of course, green infrastructure is a central part of creating such places. Next slide, please. And which is why for a number of years we've run the Green Infrastructure Partnership. The GIP is a network of more than 2,000 people and organisations that support the creation, enhancement, protection and promotion of green infrastructure in the UK. It's free to join if you haven't joined already. I believe a colleague will be putting a link in the chat function. So please do visit the website that's on the screen and sign up to receive newsletters and more information about future events. Next slide, please. Just to remind people of the format for this morning, I will stop speaking very soon. You will all be relieved to hear, and we will hear about sort of some scene setting from Lucy with a panel responding to that. Next slide, please. Throughout the morning, we will have opportunities to put questions to most of our speakers. So please do use the Q&A function. So it's hard for us to keep an eye on the chat. So please use the Q&A function to ask questions to our panel members and our speakers when we highlight that. But yes, lots to get through. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Lucy Hurford, who works on National Biodiversity Targets Policy at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Lucy is the policy lead for the Environment Act Habitat Target, which is to create or restore at least 500,000 hectares of a range of wildlife-rich habitat outside of protected sites by 2042. Welcome, Lucy, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Fiona. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here. As Fiona just said, my name is Lucy Hurford and I work in the DEFRA National Biodiversity Policy team. I'm here today just to try and give a bit of a strategic overview of the government's priorities for nature restoration, which will hopefully set the scene for some of the more detailed conversations that you'll be having later this morning. Next slide, please. So Fiona has very helpfully already provided a quick intro to the 5 priorities for the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs set by the Secretary of State earlier this year. Just as a quick reminder, these are to clean up our rivers, lakes and seas, to create a roadmap to move Britain to a zero waste economy, to support farmers to boost our food security, to ensure nature's recovery, and to protect communities from flooding. These priorities each have a crucial role to play in the government's central mission to grow our economy. And for this talk, I'll be focusing on the priorities for nature recovery, but I think it's really important to reiterate that each of these priorities are very much linked and will support each other's delivery. Next slide, please. So we have 4 legally binding national biodiversity targets, which are set in the Environment Act, which was commenced in 2021. So these are to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030, to then improve species abundance by at least 10% compared to 2030 by 2042, to reduce the risk of species extinction to below its 2022 level by 2042, and to restore or create at least 500,000 hectares of a range of wildlife-rich habitat outside of protected sites by 2042. These are legally binding targets, and they provide the legislative framework that drives government's nature recovery priorities. There are also additional commitments within the Environmental Improvement Plan, including commitments relating to sites of special scientific interest, SSIs, and our international commitments, such as to effectively protect and manage 30% of our land and sea by 2030. Next slide, please. So I think a key thing is to kind of just quickly talk through how we expect these targets to be measured. It's really important that we can show progress against these targets to make sure that we're delivering for them. So the species abundance targets will be measured using the indicators of species abundance in England once they're fully developed. And these were published as an official statistic in development in May this year. The species extinction target will be measured using a new England level red list index, which assesses the risk of species extinction in England based on Great Britain data. The baseline red list index was published in 2022, and the indicator will be completely updated every 10 years, with the next update expected in 2032. And finally, the indicator for reporting progress towards the habitat target is currently in development, but will consist of the number of hectares where action is known to have been or is being undertaken that is reasonably expected to create or restore wildlife-rich habitats outside of protected sites since the target came into force on the 30th of January 2023. Information on what counts towards the habitat target is also available online, and we can also make sure that link is shared to this publication as well. Next slide, please. So biodiversity is an inherently complex area, and we are definitely only at the beginning of the journey in understanding how to meet these targets and deliver for them. But current evidence shows that we need to deliver 3 broad actions at scale to be successful. And these 3 actions are restoration and creation of wildlife-rich habitat, which includes through high uptake of agri-environment schemes as a key delivery mechanism, but also tackling pressures on biodiversity, including from pollution, and taking targeted action for species where needed. Next slide, please. I also wanted to talk quickly about access to nature, recognizing that that might be of interest to the audience here today. So there are huge health and well-being benefits which can be reaped from accessing nature, and it's also crucial if we are to develop our environmental targets, as by accessing nature, people care about it and are more likely to display pro-environmental behaviours. Despite this, though, we know that access to nature isn't equal, with people from low socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnic minority groups being less likely to have nature close to home. Particular groups such as disabled people also experience barriers to engaging with nature. We want to change this by making sure everyone can access nature close to where they live and supporting engagement regardless of your background. The government is already delivering several policies to increase access to nature, including working to complete the King Charles III England Coast Path, which at around 2,700 miles will be the longest waymarked and maintained coast walking route in the world. Over 2,000 miles have now been approved as King Charles III England Coast Path, with over 1,000 miles already open. It will also create 250,000 hectares of new open access land within the coastal margin. Other work includes designating Wainwright's Coast to Coast route along the north of England as a national trail, and delivering the £16 million Access to All programme, which consists of a package of targeted measures in our protected landscapes, national trails, forests, and the wider countryside to make access to green and blue spaces more inclusive. Future policy in this area is still being scoped, and more details will be made available in due course. What we do know, though, is that this government made manifesto commitments to improving access to nature, so we're highly motivated in this space. Next slide, please. So there's currently a lot of strategic and cross-cutting work taking place to ensure that the work underway will deliver effectively towards the priority of nature recovery. So this includes the review and revision of the Environmental Improvement Plan. So we're developing a revised statutory plan to protect and restore our natural environment with delivery information to help meet each of our ambitious Environment Act targets. There's also work taking place across government on planning reform, with DEFRA working closely with MHCLG on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Nature recovery remains a top priority alongside the need to overhaul the planning system, grow the economy, and reach net zero. This definitely isn't a matter of choosing one of these priorities over another, and sustained economic growth depends upon a healthy natural environment. Government is determined to transform the system to ensure a win-win for house building and nature, using development to fund nature recovery where currently both are stalled. Next slide, please. So just before I wrap up, I wanted to kind of give a summary of the many different delivery levers that we expect will contribute towards delivery of our biodiversity targets. So these include, but are definitely not limited to, agri-environment schemes, which will play a key role in delivering our targets. This includes the Landscape Recovery Scheme, which is supporting over 50 projects covering 240,000 hectares. Biodiversity net gain has already been mentioned today, so an approach to development and land management that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was beforehand. This means protecting existing habitats and ensuring that lost or degraded habitats are compensated for by enhancing or creating habitats that are of equal or greater value to wildlife and people. I'm sure everyone here will know that planning permissions granted in England, with a few exemptions, now have to deliver at least 10% BNG. Following the mitigation hierarchy, developers must deliver new or enhance existing habitats where they cannot avoid impacts. Then we also have local nature recovery strategies, which are a new system of spatial strategies introduced in the Environment Act 2021. These will set the strategic priorities for nature recovery in an area and map actions that could be taken to achieve these priorities. 48 responsible authorities are currently preparing the LNRSs for their area, with publication expected from November 2024 onwards, and we had the first publication in November for the West of England Combined Authority, which is very exciting. There's also the Green Infrastructure Framework, which provides standards and guidance for local authorities and others to plan multifunctional green infrastructure networks in towns and cities. This was published in 2023, and the framework was recently updated. Work is also underway on the forthcoming Land Use Framework for England, which will consider how cross-governmental issues such as energy and food security and how we can expand nature-rich habitats such as wetlands, peat bogs, and forests. The Species Survival Fund is a programme through which DEFRA has awarded £25 million to projects which will create and restore habitats, including heathland, grasslands, and wetlands. For example, in the project Wetter for Waders, the Wildflower and Wetland Trust will work across 300 hectares of floodplain, grazing marsh, and freshwater habitat to re-wet and restore the landscape for wildlife. We also have the Species Recovery Programme, which funds projects taking targeted action for threatened species. An example of the success of this programme includes, in partnership with BugLife, the wart-biter bush cricket has been reintroduced and is now present in good numbers at a chalk grassland site in Sussex. In October this year, the government launched an independent review into the water sector regulatory system as part of a reset of the water sector to improve delivery for the natural environment and for customers. We also have England's 44 protected landscapes, which cover 24.5% of land, but contain half of our priority habitats and SSSIs. The new government is committed to making these special places greener, wilder, and more accessible, and we're currently considering the best ways to do this, and we'll be working with a wide range of stakeholders to consider different options to maximise their contribution to our Environment Act targets and international 30 by 30 commitment. The government has committed to delivering for nature, taking action to meet our Environment Act targets, and working in partnership with civil society, communities, and business to restore and protect our natural world. That brings me to the end, so I'll pass over to our panel.
Thank you ever so much, Lucy. And I'm really sorry, I should have said before that unfortunately Lucy has to dash off, so we can't put questions to her. I know we have had a question about guidance on local nature recovery strategies, so but we have Jim talking in the third session from the Environment Agency, so perhaps we can put that one to him. But thank you ever so much, Lucy. We really appreciate that sort of overarching context. And as you said, we will now hand over to invite our panel to give their reflections. Right, so I'm going to invite each of our three panel members just to give their initial thoughts and reflections. So I can see Peter and I can see Julia on our screens, and Richard, if you wouldn't mind just putting your camera on. So yes, there you are. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So first of all, I'm going to invite Peter Neal, who's a landscape architect, environmental planner and ecologist with over 30 years of experience, to give us his thoughts and reflections. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fiona. And it was great to hear all of those vast initiatives that Lucy has outlined in her opening presentation. And it's quite clear there is a substantial policy framework for both biodiversity net gain, nature recovery, green infrastructure frameworks. I think the target that shouts out at me the most is that 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat outside protected sites, and I would like to say inside urban conurbations, but I would add that myself because I think the opportunities here for urban communities planning and placemaking is substantial. But the relationship between DEFRA and MHCLG, I think, is the key relationship. We want much more joined up policy across all government departments, but I think that is the key one to make progress on. Now, it's encouraging to see the proposed revisions for NPPF, strengthening net gain requirements. There's reference to Natural England's green infrastructure standards. They're promoting the use of urban greening factors and green flag criteria. We're making progress, and it's nice to start seeing that joining up in some of the work that Natural England has been promoting for the last year and a half on the National Framework of Green Infrastructure Standards. Looks to be having traction. We want to see the new version of NPPF to be reassured that it is there, but that looks encouraging. And we have our National Design Guide, our National Model Design Code. And so I think there are opportunities that abound for landscape and green infrastructure in developing particularly, say, ambitious design codes, as design coding, I think, is here to stay, even if perhaps the Office for Place isn't. But I think it's really looking at embedding a lot of what Lucy was talking through in our planning and placemaking process. And I think whilst we would really love to see more joined up policy across government, which obviously will be a good thing, I think there are plenty of tools and good practice that we can draw on to better integrate green infrastructure in our placemaking, or be it retrofit or new build. And I think it's the challenge for us collectively to join up the dots, to work with what we've got, with the aspiration to have a better joined up policy, but actually joining the dots and establishing, I think, more integrated frameworks at the local level, and using spatial planning as the means to do that. And so taking those objectives that Lucy has set out and actually embedding them in our placemaking frameworks. And so I think spatially is the key issue. What does it look like on the ground? How does it all join up? Where are our networks and connections? And how can we do that? Local authorities and the planning process is key. But I think if I had one further request for this, what is a relatively new government, is to reconsider the roles of regional planning, because we have previously had regional, sub-regional, and particularly city regional frameworks that I think provide the greatest potential for developing ambitious, strategic, coordinated investment frameworks for green infrastructure, and enhancing public realm, our urban landscapes, joining up our public parks. And I think when we look back at some of the great examples of the past with the Tees Valley, say the Leeds City regional green infrastructure frameworks, the phenomenal work that Glasgow's done across the city, across different local authorities, on the Clyde Valley Green Network, or even London's All London Green Grid, I think that's where we will be able to deliver spatially and practically and physically what Lucy has set out in terms of policy. And I'd love to see that within the urban environment. and I think that is key. So that's my call for return of regional or city regional spatial strategies as part of the mix.
Thank you, Peter. And you may well get your wish, I think. But yes, lots to unpack there, lots to come back to, I think. But first of all, before we do that, we will I'll introduce Richard Benwell, who's Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link. Before taking on his current role, Richard worked for the RSPB, Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and as an advisor to Michael Gove while he was Environment Secretary. So welcome, Richard, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Fiona, and it was great to hear Lucy's presentation and the clarity with which she set out the environmental targets that we've now got in law under the Environment Act. It's brilliant, isn't it, to have a framework of legally binding targets for the improvement of nature, and it's really good to see DEFRA start to treat the apex goal of halting the decline of nature by 2030 as a guiding star. But even as we spoke, DEFRA published the latest biodiversity indicators. They came out at 9:30 today. And I was cheekily keeping an eye as they came out, and there's a pretty damning line in the overview that says no single indicator of the 24 that they published is improving it both in the short term and the long term. And the overall trajectory, while there are some really positive notes in there, remains one of decline. And that's a really important background for this discussion, because planning has a role to play on that at every level. And Lucy set out some of the tools that the government now has to change the way that we do land management to be nature positive. And those all have potential, but they are far from yet delivering. Net gain is meant to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but we know that well over 90% of planning applications are avoiding net gain at the moment. And there's very, very little activity in the off-site market for environmental improvement through net gain, and mechanisms for transparency on actual delivery of habitat improvements on site are still really, really in their infancy and uncertain. Lucy talked about the excellent local nature recovery strategies. I love local nature recovery strategies. They have such huge potential for bringing together different stakeholders to balance our need for housing, for healthy, sustainable food production, and for nature recovery. But it remains the case that the link between local nature recovery strategies and local plans and planning more generally is extremely weak. There is law on the statute book to make that stronger, but it hasn't yet been commenced by ministers. So the requirement to take into account local nature recovery strategies in local plans isn't yet active. It's their ability to guide net gain or environmental land management isn't yet operational. So that crucial tool isn't yet doing the job it should of trying to integrate those nature priorities into planning decisions. And similarly with environmental land management, the other big option that Lucy talked about, we've got some good things going with sustainable farming incentive, but the big ticket items of landscape recovery and agro-environment schemes still aren't out the door from DEFRA. Against this, very briefly, we have a resurgence, it seems, of the rhetoric of 2020. I can't not mention Sir Keir Starmer's speech last Friday and his caricature of the HS2 at compensation tunnel, which we all agree was badly handled. It was left until the last minute. Too much money was spent on designing something that looked like it was from SpaceX. But to suggest that the answer is to simplify and deregulate planning, and to describe planning as having a chokehold on development, is a fundamental misapprehension of what the planning system is for, in terms of being able to balance those competing interests in a way where we can get positives for all. So very briefly, we hope that the good work that DEFRA and MHCLG have been doing behind the scenes to find win-wins for planning and development and nature can cut through that rhetoric. And there's real potential there if we pursue options for developer contributions to strategic nature recovery at every scale. So developers and other polluters paying more to restore nature at national site level, but also in urban greening and peri-urban context. There's huge potential for a more spatially driven approach to planning for nature and development at the same time. And there the land use framework has a strong role to play alongside refilling that regional development scale that Peter was talking about. For that to work, it needs to be target driven. So we know how much more nature we need and that it is able to influence decisions under Town and Country Planning Act and under the Planning Act. And finally, we need to make sure that where development happens, it's green by design. So we're still a long way behind other jurisdictions in thinking about requirements for green infrastructure as standard in new development, but also in the fabric of buildings themselves, whether it's from water efficiency standards, where we're a long way behind in terms of litres per person per day in other European jurisdictions, or thinking about things like swift bricks and hedgehog highways and green roofs along the way. If government can do that, strategic planning driven by nature recovery targets, developer contributions aggregated to restore nature at scale, and building nature into the fabric of development as standard, then we can hope that it can turn around those biodiversity indicators next time they're published.
Thank you very much, Richard. And finally, Julia, so Julia Thrift, our Director of Healthier Placemaking at the TCPA. She joined the organisation in 2013 and manages projects concerning planning and public health, green infrastructure and planning and social justice. Julia, your reflections and thoughts, please.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, I hesitate to agree with the other speakers because that makes a really dull conversation, but I do agree with a lot of what Peter and Richard have just said, particularly about the fragmentation between government departments' approach to green infrastructure. It needs to be much better coordinated between DEFRA and MHCLG. It was really good to hear from Lucy that it sounds as if there is much more collaboration going on behind the scenes, which is very good to hear. And we'll wait and see what the new MPPF says. I think it's worth reflecting that the 25-year environment plan was published by a previous government in 2018, and that's nearly 7 years ago. And it was a very powerful cross-government document that had the ambition to leave the environment in a better state than we all inherited it. And 7 years later, not very much has happened, judging by the indicators that Rich has just described. And I think one of the many reasons behind that is that a lot of the good work that DEFRA has done hasn't been fully supported by other departments, particularly MHCLG. And so, for instance, as a result of that 25-year environment plan, DEFRA and Natural England created the Green Infrastructure Standards Framework, which is really, really good. A very powerful set of standards, huge data. It's a free resource that councils and communities can turn to. But embedding those standards is very weak. So when they're mentioned in the current version of the National Planning Policy Framework, it's optional whether those standards are achieved. And while things remain optional, they'll happen in some places, but they won't happen in other places. And my concern about that is that that means that those good standards tend to be achieved in areas that have high land values, and they tend to be areas that tend to have better off communities where health is better. So there's what that means by making things like those standards optional. It means that it's likely that the places with good land values where development is already quite of a high quality are likely to get better and better. But the places where land values are low, communities tend to be poorer, health tends to be worse, they might not get those good standards delivered. And there's a real danger that we're going to exacerbate the inequalities across the country. And that's bad for the environment, it's bad for the economy, and it's also bad for people's health. We know that there's a lot of injustice between communities in terms of the amount of tree canopy cover. Wealthier areas tend to have more trees, more parks, better green infrastructure, and poorer areas tend to have fewer trees, fewer parks, not very, worse quality green spaces. So those inequalities are now very well known and mapped, and we need to try and address them. And that means making good standards mandatory, not optional. And another aspect of the fragmentation, I think, is that throughout the country, there are lots of communities that really understand the benefits of green spaces and trees and really want to green their neighbourhoods. And at the moment, it's very difficult to see how the good work that's going on in communities around the country actually adds up and contributes to the government's overarching targets. So as far as we know, for instance, community tree planting, which is a huge force, thousands and thousands of trees are planted by communities, but it looks as though that doesn't contribute to the national tree planting targets. So there are all sorts of disconnects and fragmentation. And I think if we were to have a much clearer national campaign that everybody could contribute to greening, that would be incredibly powerful. And at the moment, it just feels far too fragmented. But we'll wait to see what happens as the new government settles in and announces more policies.
Thank you very much, Julia. I think that, yes, that fragmentation piece is an important one. Thank you to those people who are putting their questions in the Q&A. Please continue to do that. I will put some to our panel in just a second. I just wanted to pick up, because everybody's mentioned the relationship between MHCLG and DEFRA. I think we all know that's really vitally important, certainly to our audience today and in practice. Richard, you, of course, mentioned Sir Keir Starmer's language, which felt like quite a backward step. We also heard Angela Rayner talking about newts and housing, which also I think is very much that similar vein. Julia mentioned that Lucy suggested there maybe is more collaboration behind the scenes than that language suggested. From a wildlife and countryside link point of view, is that how the environmental NGO sort of sector is feeling, or should we be positive, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Thank you. Well, in many ways, we were feeling positive. When the new government came in, it spoke about collaboration, and we saw some really good early indications of that. So we saw Minister Pennycook sitting alongside Mr. Reid to talk about how to do development hand in hand with nature restoration. We heard a line that the government wanted to build on the good work it did on nutrient neutrality during the Levelling Up and infrastructure bill a couple of years ago, where the Labour Party did defend that ability to do both together. And we've had some really positive bilateral, even trilateral departmental discussions about how you can take a more strategic approach to nature recovery. So I do believe that there's good and better departmental cooperation going on. The question is whether that has the sort of political weight to cut through what is always a sort of politically attractive narrative about overmighty regulators and overburdensome regulation, and that sort of political imperative to show that you're cutting back on rules to simplify and make things easier, and an overarching growth narrative. I still think there's a way for the government to find a way through this that does the right thing, but alongside ambitious planning reform, there will need to be a shift in mentality that sees the planning system not about minimizing harm on nature and controlling the impact of development on natural infrastructure, but seeing a positive role for planning where it sees green infrastructure and environmental recovery as part of the agenda for the planning system, allocating space and changing land use choices so that the planning system actually contributes to nature recovery. There's still that road, but it's got to win through that sort of attractive oversimplification.
Absolutely. Peter, I'm going to come to you. I think, again, there was a theme, I think, through everyone around the sort of the urban biodiversity being important. Somebody has, and I think this picks up on some of your comments, somebody has highlighted that, of course, with a hectare-driven target for nature recovery, how do we make sure that urban spaces close to people do benefit from that, or sort of are seen as an important part of that, because of course it's easier to deliver major area change in rural or peri-urban settings. So yeah, how do we make sure that urban biodiversity recovery is very much at the heart of the agenda?
I think that's to integrate work on green infrastructure frameworks and also nature recovery networks, that they're not looked at in isolation, so that they are either, say, a recreation or an active travel or a biodiversity initiative, but they're all joined up. And I think that is fundamentally important. And so this integration is key. And actually, I think whilst we are focusing very much on DEFRA and MHCLG, DFT, our transport, and particularly in urban areas, are local cycling and walking infrastructure networks or investment networks, LC WIPs, are key. That sounds very sort of techie and anarchy in terms of terminology, but that is linear corridors joining up green spaces, public parks, river corridors, and other routes for active travel, but they need to be wildlife rich, and they will then connect neighborhoods, improve access, because you can move between spaces in a hopefully untrafficked, more active travel, walking, cycling network, to bigger and richer green spaces, public parks, but they can be wildlife rich habitats, and they're outside our protected sites. So it contributes to that, I think, is key. I will reflect on our sort of political position we're in at the moment. And whilst we all aspire for things to be better sooner and quicker, we're at the start of a new government term, and we don't know how long this will run. I reflect back on when we had a previous Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, in communities and local government, with the power, but also the continuity over time of setting policy, driving with the urban renaissance in the late 90s and taking us into the noughties. And that continuity of policy making, joining up and sticking with it, is key. So I think it is really interesting that we have a Deputy Prime Minister in communities and local government with Angela Rayner at the moment. Time will tell, but I think that continuity is key. And then the support from national to regional government, and particularly our city regions, I think, and working with our elected mayors to give political power to placemaking, I think, is also key. I would love to say more about that, but I won't use up all the time we've got left.
Well, yeah, no, there's a really, I think we're expecting the devolution white paper, or we certainly were, relatively soon. So it'll be really interesting to see if there's reference to yes, nature and nature recovery within that. So I am really mindful of time. I've got 2 more minutes until I have to hand over to Julia to chair the second session. So I'm going to smudge a couple of questions together. Apologies to the audience, but all of our, I think, panel mentioned strategic and that need for bigger, and of course, bigger, better, more joined up. We've been talking about for a long time. So somebody has asked, why are policies for and design of green infrastructure as a network not as sophisticated as other types of national infrastructure? So that linked with the expected land use framework. I think we understand that DEFRA said it can't do everything, but of course it should be an opportunity for that bigger join up of nature recovery and land use. So in a minute, 30 seconds each, how do we get that bigger recognition of green infrastructure as a true, on a par with other infrastructure? And is the land use framework an opportunity for it? If I start with Richard, and then I'll go Julia and Peter.
We don't treat critical natural infrastructure as infrastructure at all. And I would love to see a national policy statement for critical natural infrastructure that's allocated space at scale for important ecosystems as networks, and identified their investment, maintenance and restoration capital investment need in the same way as we do for any other infrastructure assets. That would be a great start.
Thanks. Peter? Oh,
Look
sorry,
at all-
Julia, and then Peter, sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Fiona. Yes, and so why don't we treat it as proper infrastructure? And I'm going to point the finger at the Treasury here. And every few years, a leading economist points out that a high quality environment is absolutely fundamental to economic growth and stability. So we had the Stern Review in 2006, then we had Dieter Helm and the Natural Capital Committee in 2018, and then we had the Dasgupta Review in 2021. And all these leading economists say that green infrastructure and nature is absolutely essential. And the Treasury seems to pat them on the back, give them a knighthood and ignore them. And I think that's a huge problem.
Thanks, Julia. And Peter, last but by no means least.
I would say learn by example. And if you want a UK example, just look at the 200-mile green network that Clyde Valley in Glasgow is establishing as a framework for active travel. If you like your examples international, I often make reference to Atlanta and the Beltline. I've spoken at a previous Green Infrastructure Partnership conference, and we published this in TCPA Journal, but that is an integrated network, public transit and active travel structured, funded by the city, joining up parks and public spaces, but particularly joining up poor and rich neighborhoods to provide an integrated green infrastructure network around the entire city, taking people out of cars, building local economies, enhancing local neighborhoods in an integrated and joined up manner. There are great examples in the UK and abroad. Let's try and repeat them in many other of our great cities.
Thank you ever so much. And I think that point of comes back to one of your earlier contributions, Peter, where yes, we don't have the ideal policy framework by any stretch of the imagination, but people are doing great things. So let's keep trying to be aspirational and ambitious, I think. Right, thank you ever so much to Peter, Richard and Julia. I've run over by 2 minutes, apologies, Julia, but I'm now going to hand over the chair to Julia so she can cope with that. Apologies to those that we didn't quite get to all of the questions, but if Richard and Peter don't have to dash off, if you are able to type some answers, that would be much appreciated. But equally, if you don't have time, we can put them to other panel members. But thank you, everybody. And I hope, yeah, over to Julia. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And so after that lively start to the morning, we're now moving on to our second session. And this session is going to be about biodiversity net gain, which we've heard about briefly this morning. So as many of you will know, biodiversity net gain, or BNG as it's known, was introduced in England following the Environment Act. And for about a year now, it's been a legal requirement that almost all new development results in a net gain of 10%. In other words, once the development's complete, there must be 10% more biodiversity than before the development was created. And ideally, this should be on the same site as the development, but it could be nearby, or failing that, the developer could pay a credit to the government to buy some biodiversity elsewhere. And the idea was that that would generate markets for biodiversity units. It's really complicated, but it is a legal requirement. It's also particularly difficult in very built-up areas, because if your development site has zero biodiversity, then a 10% increase is zero. So that's going to be a challenge. So we're going to have a presentation and then a discussion to try and work out what's actually happening out there. Is biodiversity net gain working? Are there unintended consequences? So I mentioned that it's very difficult to get this to work in urban areas, particularly very highly built up areas. So I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who's from the City of London, which is probably the most built up area in the country. And so we're going to have a look at the ambitious things that the City of London are doing to try and make that very dense urban area greener and more biodiverse. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, John Hart. John is a planning officer at the City of London. He's a chartered town planner who's worked at the City of London Corporation for over 18 years and currently works within the policy and strategy team. and he has a passion for urban greening and turning the grey to green. So welcome, John, and over to you.
Thanks, Julia, and hi everyone. I'm in the office today, so apologies if there's a bit of noise in the background. Yes, so as Julia says, I've worked at the city quite some time now, mainly in the plan and policy team. I have done a bit of DM work as well as the development management. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So I guess in terms of just policy, we have a local plan at the city. So our adopted plan was in 2015. We're looking to, that was 10 years ago now, so we're looking to update that. This has to be in general conformity with the Mayor's London plan, which was adopted in 2021. So we have a draft City Plan 2040. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an idea of a timetable. So I'll go through this and then we'll head on to the B&G policy. But at the end of August, we submitted the plan to the Secretary of State, and the inspectors were appointed in September. So we're just waiting to hear back from them. But we're hoping this draft city plan will be adopted by 2026. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit of context of the square mile. We're a big organisation managing own land assets and holdings. And as a local planning authority, we manage the square mile, which is this area. So it's quite a small area of London. As Julia mentioned earlier, this has quite high land value. So we're a bit unique in that regard in terms of other outer London parts of the city. So our approaches often conflict or do not fit city circumstances. So this is something we'll come on to later with B&G. The local plan provide strong policy steers, but we're adaptable to change. There's only 9,000 residents in the city, so it's quite small. So it's mainly commercial development. I think the latest estimates are saying there's 675,000 workers who come into the city, and we're in the essential activity zone, so which is the CAS. There's many listed buildings, conservation areas, and scheduled ancient monuments. In terms of open spaces, we do have some nice pocket parks, but they are quite limited existing areas, as many of the sites are built out to their red line historically. Next slide, please. This is just an image I took in the summer up on top of a commercial development at 4 Cannon Street. And this is just showing you a type of green roof that we're starting to see in the city. So this is an intensive green roof area here, just off some meeting rooms. And on top, you can see you may be able to just make out on top of that meeting room an extensive green roof. So this development actually has some lovely views of St. Paul's and the river. So if we just move on to the next slide. This is just to give you a flavour of where our green roof areas are in the city. So in terms of B&G, we'd expect this as a habitat to be kind of delivered green and so intensive and extensive green roofs. As of last year, we have about 128 of these. There's a cluster here along the river. In terms of the size of these areas added up, we're talking 10 Wembley football pitches. But also in the pipeline, we've got a lot more as well. So looking at another 40 to 50 by 2030. In terms of the makeup of these green roofs, about half are extensive, and these can include biosolar green roofs, which have PV panels laid on top for added sustainability benefits, and intensive green roofs make up the other half of that, which is a bit like the picture I showed you. We could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of, we have several policies in the plan, which we'll come on to. So urban greening policy, which has been briefly mentioned, the urban greening factor, general biodiversity policies, where we talk about our biodiversity action plan, the LNRS, which is also mentioned. This is something which will most likely replace that document. And then our new biodiversity net gain policy, which is why I'm here today really to talk about, which we'll come on to. We do also have a policy on trees, and that's to kind of retain mature and semi-mature trees in the city, and the biodiversity action plan, which I mentioned. I should also say, even though we're quite a built-up environment, we do have 13 sites of importance for nature conservation in the city, and obviously the River Thames is a SMINC for a site of metropolitan importance for nature conservation as well. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the urban greening factor, back in 2018, we worked with consultants, Green Infrastructure Consultancy, to look at how we can increase greening on developments. So it's what's set out in the London plan, so it is adopted policy, but it's still draft policy in ours. But the intention is to set a target of 0.3 for commercial and residential developments in the city. But it's worth bearing in mind this is just to do with mainly proposed development, so it doesn't factor in existing habitats on site, many of which we have 0, but we'll come on to that in a minute. So if we could just go to the next one. So as Julia's already set out, in terms of biodiversity net gain, became a statutory requirement back in February. So we've set a draft local policy target of looking at 3 biodiversity units per hectare. So this is to challenge developments aim higher than the statutory 10% which the government set out. So many sites in the city have 0 baselines. We're talking a very high number. So we view this as not a realistic target. And this can be easily met, the 10%, by just planting a couple of trees on sites with 0 baseline. But it's worth bearing in mind, most of these 0 baseline sites would be exempt from B&G, as they do not impact more than 25 square meters of existing habitat. And I think there is a linear habitat as well. So back in, well, I say back, last year we worked with Greengage, who I think here today, we looked at 35 development sites across the city. So these were schemes which were in the pipeline or built out, and this evidence informed the policy target of setting this 3 biodiversity units per hectare. So rather than a percentage increase, and we believe that this would result in a lot more greening in a high density environment. So yes, and this would apply, I should say, to major developments. So we see that a bit like how the UGF works, the urban greening factor. But if we could go to the next slide. In terms of, we had a consultation on the city plan, see what people's thoughts were on it, and in terms of issues raised by representation, so we call them reps, we did receive some objections to this policy and some observations from the City Property Association, so the CPA, the House Builders Federation, which I think are here today, and the City of London Law Society, and also some amenity groups as well, which were saying, could we be actually doing more than what we're proposing in the draft policy? So the main issues were that providing greening on site should not be a tick box exercise. Thinking of ideas such as on-site, so I should have said earlier, this was B&G can be delivered on-site or off-site. We see this policy is developing on-site, potentially if they can't meet the requirement, looking at off-site. But could you do both? Yeah. So, and this is before you get to the statutory credits, which I think have already been mentioned. In the city, there's limited opportunities in improving open spaces deficiency. So this was something which has been raised. So we do have high areas of deficiency in open space. And also people wanted more prioritization of ground level spaces. And I think that's something kind of some of the speakers have already picked up on, really. And then also some queries on green walls. How much biodiversity do they actually provide? There's a lot of different types of green walls we get in the city. Some of them are quite intensive, but you can obviously get your standard climbers such as ivy. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. I should have said these pictures actually, which you keep seeing, are from on top of an investment bank in the city, which is along the river. So this is a biosolar green roof. And then this is not how it looked when it was built out, but through someone going up there and basically really improving the habitat over time, it's become quite a very nice biodiverse green roof. So they don't all look like this, I should say. So in terms of what we've learned so far, we see 10% B&G is not relevant in a high density environment. However, that's to say we still would need to do this as a policy, so this would be like an add-on. Most of the habitats set out in the statutory biodiversity metric are for rural sites, so as I've said, most of them would be delivered via green roofs, but also through public realm enhancements at the ground level of the scheme. The interaction between the urban greener factor and the BNG policies, they're two separate metrics. Like I said earlier, UGF just tends to base on the proposed development and not existing habitats, where BNG takes into account existing. And capturing, how do we capture these BNG sites for monitoring? So obviously you've got your 30 years from when the scheme's built out. And then working with our colleagues in the development management team who deal with the applications at the coalface and condition wording and legal implications, whether that's via conditions and Section 106 agreements, which are legal agreements. And also, I should have said earlier, I'm not an ecologist. These roles can vary, but also understanding the ecology and planning crossover. So I know when we worked with GreenGauge, we asked them to kind of produce a jargon buster, and that was looking at different terms that we're not really familiar with as planners, such as strategic significance, significant enhancements, habitat distinctiveness, habitat condition, trade and rural, spatial risk, all these sort of things. And in terms of the next few slides, if we can move on to them, we're just going to look at some real world examples of what we tend to see in the city. So the one on the left, again, is from the same development. Which is just trying to introduce some habitats and for invertebrates. And then the one on the right is from another standard commercial development. What we tend to see is occupiers want multiple terrace levels so they can go out on, and this is just one, and you may be able to just see below, there's one below and there's a few extra ones. So extensive green roof and intensive green roof, and trying to balance this. So the challenge is to include biodiversity measures. So if we just move on to the next one. This is just a scheme at Chancery House, which is on the city fringe in the west of the city, so near Westminster and Camden, I think it is. So more green and required in the city, but often it's not realistic. So we have tall buildings and small sites which are constrained. However, BNG could deliver more opportunities. So for example, this was a scheme which was a private car park off the development. When the development was built, they've turned it into a pocket park, which is open when the office hours are open, so not all the time like your normal park. So the next slide, please. This is just another example of what can be achieved on site. So this is actually the same development I showed you at the start with St Paul's. This is for Cannon Street. It was a servicing to the office building, and now it's built out as a pocket park. It's a space we manage by City Gardens. It's at Distaff Lane, so just south of St Paul's Cathedral. We can go on to the next one. So in terms of BNG, there's many challenges and issues, and as seen here on some articles, one from the planner, whatever happened to biodiversity net gains. This was a recent article because there was a big deal made of it about 9 months ago, and now it's settling down. How is it all working in LPAs? And this is just from a podcast which was dealt in room 106 about the challenge and face biodiversity net gain, as we've kind of and how LPAs are grappling with these. Yes, so if we could go on to the next slide, not too far from the end now. So I guess this is just London Wall Place, which is development incorporating historic features, part of London Wall and the church here. So this was all built out previously, just you couldn't see any of this greening. But it's understanding the national BNG requirements and draft local policy, understanding, the de minimis or not, are sites de minimis, zero baselines or not. So often when we receive an application, is the information submitted? So it's clear that this is the case, but this is not always consistent. Lack of ecological expertise. You don't have an in-house ecologist at a city. Some LPAs do, and evaluating data submitted within LPAs. In the city, we have a number of historic buildings, listed buildings. So could there be limited options for greening on some of these sites? However, from some research carried out, which I'm going to mention briefly, which some colleagues in the climate resilience team did, biodiversity do seem to be drawn to some of these historic sites, which is quite interesting. And applicants, are they maximising greening? So it's hard to measure due to constraints. On-site squeezing, so obviously our policy, our draft policy, I should say, is looking at on-site, but could this have unintended consequences and not fulfill BNG objectives and following the biodiversity gain hierarchy? Tall buildings, we have a number of tall buildings built out in the pipeline. One was approved last week. Some of these are really trying to maximise the green on the site, but at upper levels, how achievable would this be due to conditions on some of these tall buildings? And applications meeting, we're starting to find applications are meeting the urban green factor requirements, but not necessarily hitting that 3 biodiversity units per hectare. They may be hitting around 2. So if there's a shortfall, and are they based on, and the UGF, as I've said multiple times, are based on proposed and not existing habitats. So just a couple more slides, and I think that's me. So in terms of BNG, what next? Commission further work with Green Gauge Environmental, which we're working on at the moment, on how to best implement BNG through planning applications. The aim is to provide guidance on how BNG is a statutory requirement, tailored to the context of the city's bespoke BNG approach. And BNG software, there are multiple companies out there that are working with LPAs at the moment on how this information will be captured and monitored over those 30 years. We're working at the moment with colleagues, like I said earlier, the climate resilience team, looking at the need for the city to set strategic significant levels, local nature recovery strategies. So it may be that most of these habitats will be biodiverse green roofs, climate resilient planting, for example, non-native trees, which are drought tolerant to the urban heat island. And then, as I've said earlier, Imperial College have been working with some of our colleagues, and they've been looking at some of the green roofs in the city and bioacoustic monitoring to understand the biological value of green roofs in the urban areas. So although we have many of these, and what's actually going on the ground. And then BNG, upcoming changes in legislation. There was stuff rolled out after the 12th of February, and I'm sure we'll see more. But that's it from me.
Thank you, John. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking. And some of those before and after pictures of rather scrappy-looking bits of service area turned into a pocket park are very inspiring. We've had lots of people in the chat asking if you could share various documents, things like the jargon buster, which lots of people would like. If you're able to post links in the chat, that would be great. If not, if there are things you could share that you could send links to the TCPA afterwards, we could try and share them with delegates. But there's a lot of interest. It would be lovely if you could join the panel, but I do want to put one question to you because inevitably there are lots of people asking about maintenance. How are the green roofs maintained? Do they start off looking okay and then decline? Who pays for it? Who does it? We'd love to know.
Yeah, so I guess on the actual scheme itself, on green roofs, that would be something that would be the developers who'd be managing these spaces. So that would be set out in a condition, but our policy basically stipulates that when the site's built out, they manage these spaces. I think it depends on the sites. Historically, we tended to have a lot of extensive green roofs, which were not very deep substrates. So if you were to go and look at them now, they're not great. Those pictures I showed you earlier on top of Nomura, which is an investment bank in the city, what they've tried to do there is improve the development and improve the green roof conditions by introducing invertebrates. So I think it really varies on the sites, but yeah, what we're starting to see more of, rather than it being seen as a tick box, right, we have to do a green roof, it's more the green roofs are more integrated into the design of the development, and also what the occupiers want, so introducing terrace levels. But how do you balance, I guess, the biodiverse features on this and the monitoring? That is something that is a challenge. But yeah, that's
right.
probably it.
It sounds as though you've been learning an enormous amount over the last few years. So yeah, anything you can share in the chat or later on, I think people would really welcome. So thank you, John. We're now going to move on to our discussion session. So perhaps we could have the next slide, please. And I think we've started to hear some answers to this from John, but obviously the City of London is a very particular, unique location with its own challenges, but also its own opportunities. So I'm delighted to welcome our panel speakers. As before, I will introduce each one and let them say a few words, and then we will have some discussion and try and take some more questions. So our speakers are Rachel Daneman from the Home Builders Federation, Morgan Taylor, Director at Greengage, the environmental consultancy, and Paul Rabbits, the Chair of the Parks Management Association. So first, I'm going to ask Morgan if he's there. Can you switch on your camera? Wonderful, I can see you now. So Morgan Taylor is a director at Greengage, and he leads Greengage's nature team, providing ecological and green infrastructure design input into projects, enabling biodiversity net gains. So Morgan, in your experience, how is biodiversity net gain working in practice? Is it working, and are there any unintended consequences?
Is it working is an interesting question. I think the answer is it depends who you ask, and it depends what kind of projects that person is working on. I mean, if you just went by LinkedIn, you'd think it was the end of the world, and we have absolutely destroyed the planning system altogether. But it's obviously the problem sites that kind of shout the loudest. I think fundamentally it is doing the job that it was designed to do, or that certainly that we saw the function it providing. So we see it as that you alluded to, Julia, actually the descriptor review, all of the Dieter Helm kind of assessments. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is starting to think in a natural capital approach manner in how we strategize, deliver, and manage biodiversity as part of new development. So we're effectively starting to think about internalizing this externality of nature that has for so long just been this added extra. Of course, there are going to be teething issues. And I know we're nearly a year in now and we're still seeing lots of those teething issues, but I don't believe that is down to the fundamentals of B&G as an approach. It's more about the issues of availability of technical capacity to review and assess. However, the small sites and B&G is definitely an issue in that there is clearly kind of perverse outcomes for small developments that get caught up in B&G, and the lack of easy local habitat banks. But again, we're not going to see large scale geographically spaced habitat bank development without the need being established first. We've only had the kind of the speculative habitat banks being created by those of the deep pockets. But no doubt in years to come, we will see habitat banking, for example, in London, that John alluded to. There are no habitat banks in London for off-site contribution for those not meeting the city requirements, for example. We will no doubt see that there will be creation of habitat banks to meet these needs. To a certain extent, lots of the negatives, I think, are confirmation bias. And even myself, I think I've kind of gone into things thinking this is the issue and the issue has arisen. When we have encountered projects where the client has considered B&G from the very outset, it's been factored into the feasibility, it's been an assessment of viability, master planning, layout, costing from the very beginning, it works. I think that's what's important. At the moment, we're still seeing lots of developments that went through this feasibility stage before B&G was mandated. And so I think we're going to have this shoulder kind of couple of years where we've got a lot of plans where people are bringing them forward without having actually accounted for B&G properly. But of course there are flaws. It's not perfect, but it's also, we don't have an option to not act. I think it is considerably better than it was before, in the sense that previously we had zero levers to mandate requirement of quantified improvements in green infrastructure, and now we do. And that's the really important thing.
Great, thank you very much. So now for a different perspective, I'm going to turn to Rachel. Rachel Damon's Regional Planning Manager at the Home Builders Federation and has responsibility for planning matters in the Midlands and South West. And Rachel led on the HBF's response to biodiversity net gain requirements. So Rachel, well, how are your members finding BNG in practice?
The first thing to say is that we generally welcome BNG and we recognise the role that the development industry has to play, and house building in particular, in helping to address climate change, helping to address nature recovery. And we and everybody else have a key role to play in that. So I think the sector welcomes it generally, but it has only been in since February for large sites and April for small sites. So it's sort of too early to tell. Most of the schemes coming through were permitted if you got outlined before it came in, and therefore there's going to be a very long tail while this is implemented. So I think there's some recognition that some of the hurdles and some of the things we haven't got to yet. From local plans, no local plan is adopted yet that's been since mandatory BNG was in place. So again, the local plan picture is sort of missing from our understanding. So I think we recognise it's complicated. We recognise that post-permission BNG is a different way of doing things. We recognise that conservation covenants are new, and we recognise that there's a range of experience and understanding both amongst our membership. Some of them have been doing this for a long time voluntarily, or in parts of the country where there have been local plan policies, and for others it's all very new. So it's a real challenge. I think from our perspective, we've kind of got 7 asks at the moment of what we think needs to be done to make it work better. The first is to make sure the 10% works fully and fully functions, and the market works, and the on-site, off-site, everything works before we try and increase the percentage, because we need to make it deliver already. We think local plans should look at a baseline assessment as part of the allocation process. We think local nature recovery strategies is the missing piece of the jigsaw. They should be first. They should be informing local plans. Local plans are coming forward now. They're trying to talk about local nature recovery strategies that don't exist yet. It's all got a bit back to front, but again, there's a real potential for that map-based exercise of opportunities to work out where you can get the most value for your biodiversity investment. We think it's unhelpful for local planning authorities to produce SPD on this. There's enough guidance, there's enough information. It's just signposting, reading it, understanding it, working with people to find solutions. We think there needs to be a kind of standard for off-site BNG credits, so when developers buy them and local planning authorities consent to us using them, that everybody's happy that it's a good enough standard and it's not getting around the system, it's actually delivering the BNG. And then obviously the statutory credit system needs to have some schemes, so people that don't like development can't say, yeah, but you're just paying some money and there's no schemes to deliver them. So generally it's probably too early to tell. My bigger kind of picture conclusion, I guess, is the Lawton principles are all about bigger, better, more joined up. Therefore, on a site-by-site basis, that's not the right place to consider those issues. Local plans, local nature recovery strategies need to set that bigger picture, and there may be occasions where the best biodiversity benefit is delivered off-site, and so the hierarchy enables you to do that, and sometimes you should move down that hierarchy quickly when the small site random newt pond in the middle of nowhere isn't going to deliver any biodiversity net gain realistically. And habitat is the proxy for species, so somehow we still need to unpack what it actually means for species, because habitat in itself is not random habitat, and random places not joined up isn't going to deliver what we're intending. So that's my initial sort of start for 10 on what's working and what isn't.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think that phrase random habitat in random places is something that's been worrying lots of people. So I'm now going to turn to our next panelist, Paul Rabbits. Paul is the chair of the Parks Management Association and has had a long career in parks management and worked as a consultant in the parks and leisure sector. He's written lots of books, and he's a director of the and trustee of the Gardens Trust. And many of you on social media will know that Paul is very passionate about the role that public parks play within our communities. So, Paul, superficially, it would seem that biodiversity net gain could result in lots of new funding to make our urban parks more biodiverse that would be great for urban parks. Is this happening or not?
I'm loving, thank you, Julia. I'm loving some of the comments already about, it depends on who you ask. It's too soon to tell. It's complicated. And it is, you know, I've worked in local government 35 years, and like this has been landed on us now after various delays, etc. And you know, myself working in parks and also
working with planning colleagues about how the hell is this going to work? What is it we're going to get, and how we're going to deliver it, and how is this going to benefit parks? And it really does depend on who you ask. I sent out a round robin just a few days ago. The Parks Managers Association. I've got contacts over about 1,500 parkies. And asked them for their views on this. And is it working? Are you doing stuff with BNG? And I got a very limited, tiny response. So the answer to that is I don't think it is yet. I think it is too soon to tell. I think looking at some of the comments that have been in the chat around maintenance, and I call it the 3 M's: management, maintenance, and monitoring. It's all very well looking at the opportunities of biodiversity net gain and how this might benefit urban parks in particular. If we can't manage it, maintain it, and then monitor it, then what's the point? I could go back to days of HLF and the £1 billion invested in historic urban parks, and the issues around the management, maintenance, and monitoring of that, and seeing where we are now with historic parks starting to tip over. But that's another story. I know that some councils are now, particularly local politicians within councils, are seeing BNG that this is going to resolve all their problems. It's not. They're seeing it as a new piggy bank. It's not. Absolutely not. The response I did get from colleagues is that in places there is good progress. I think certainly where local councils, particularly county councils, are linking this up with a local nature recovery strategy and working with wildlife trusts. And with the wildlife trusts, when I looked at what they were doing, they're very, very proactive around BNG. Again, places like Nottingham City Council, again, connecting to the local nature recovery strategy. Derby, again, the LNRS, they're expecting to see benefits to some of their urban parks. Worcestershire County Council doing BNG assessments. And again, like I say, when you look at the Wildlife Trust offering services to developers, as well as some local councils, I think is excellent. So there is progress there. I think some of the issues as far as urban parks are concerned is that the cost of offsetting may actually make some places unviable. How is this going to pan out in places like Middlesbrough, Stoke, and Liverpool? Where the cost of land values is so low that actually trying to make some of these sites viable. And when Richard said that 90% of planning applications so far are avoiding BNG, well, that tells you a story. I had one Hertfordshire, I won't say which one it is, it wasn't the county, but one Hertfordshire council was saying that they're already seeing some developments coming in, and where they're having to look at BNG, making sites unviable, and that's in Hertfordshire. It's just a nonsense. The other thing is that really concerns me, and I'm trying not to be cynical, is developers may prefer to buy credits off-site, well off-site, and not actually benefit local communities. And when you look at 85% of us now live in urban areas, we've got 27,000 public parks. We're still a non-statutory service, and the scale of cuts that we've had has been unprecedented. So if we're looking at BNG, there is a real opportunity of I won't say transforming public parks, but enhancing public parks, and that accessibility to nature. And I think this is something that Peter touched on really, really well. It's that those local issues, and I think I called it local parks for local people, whatever it was. That right part, right pace, local parks for local people, and actually identifying what we need and where. And I'm not sure local councils have got to grips with that yet. And I'm not convinced that local nature recovery strategies and green infrastructure strategies are the full answer to that. And I think the alignment of those two pieces of work need to be very much aligned with a local park strategy. And that's something going back to days of Cave Space, Julia. We all remember days of Cave Space when we were all told that we had to write a park strategy and look at open space needs assessment and understanding what it is, what we've got, where it is, and how it's performing. Again, that question was asked to many of the members, and the majority of local authorities now don't have a park strategy. So how can we assess what it is that we've got without knowing and understanding locally what it is that we've got? And I think to I could go on. I think to finish
We're running
off,
out of time,
I
Paul.
know we
So
are. I think the issues around fragmentation is really important, and I think MHCLG, DEFRA, and DCMS as well is really important. And I think the other thing is that Richard touched on: green walls, green columns, green roofs. They're incredibly expensive, and as far as local government is concerned, that is something that we cannot afford. And I'm not sure is the answer in places like Middlesbrough, Stoke, and Liverpool.
great. Thank you very much, Paul. Lots there. So I think we've got a very mixed view of how it's playing out. Local nature recovery strategies have been mentioned several times as sort of the missing part to make things work a bit better. And we will be hearing about them in the next session after a short break. But just before we finish, I'd like to just put to Rachel and Morgan this question about viability. Is BNG is BNG going to work in areas of low land value? How are the economics playing out? Rachel, what do you think?
And we don't have the data, we just have lots of anecdotal stories of places where it is a challenge. I think the real game for nature is to think about it sooner. So everybody is rejoicing that BNG means we now talk about BNG and nature before the planning application is submitted rather than after. But the real benefits are if you think about it before the land's even purchased and under option. So getting that local plan adopted, getting BNG thought about at that stage, doing the baseline assessments at that stage, minimises the risk of viability problems later. But essentially what our members want is certainty on what the policy is and then flexibility on how to achieve it, so that viability issues, if they do arise, can be resolved. Some BNG solutions are expensive, some are less expensive, so it really is a partnership with the local planning authorities, so you can deliver the wins for nature and for house building, because we need the houses and the nature. So it's the earlier we can have those conversations the better, but it will be an issue in some places.
Thank you. And Morgan, do you have a quick thought about viability? Is BNG having an effect on viability?
Totally agree with Rachel. I mean, it's well, for a start, it's too early for us to have certainty. But yeah, the earlier you look at it, the less likelihood it would be. We haven't encountered any projects where BNG has meant the project has stopped. However, most of our work is in the northwest or in the southeast. I can't see it wholesale affecting viability, kind of to a point where it systematically undermines the system, on the basis that even if we go down offsite habitat banking solutions, it's not in the amount of money that we're talking about on these developments, it's not significant. What it might do is affect the major profits that are drawn. But if we really have a focus on house building and delivering nature, I think it's eminently achievable.
Wonderful. That's a great positive note to end on. I'd like to thank all of you very much, including John, who I think might still be there, for a fantastic presentation about how the City of London is overcoming the constraints of being such a built-up area. Really, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much. We now have a short break and we'll then be coming back at 11 to hear about local nature recovery strategies and all sorts of other very interesting things. So thank you very much and see you in 10 minutes.
Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. I was just thrown off Zoom momentarily there, just as I was going to open the third session. But I'm hoping that everything is up and running. So my name is Celia Davis, and I'm the Senior Projects and Policy Manager at the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm delighted to be chairing the third session of the Green Infrastructure Partnership Conference this morning. So the session that we have in store is made of two excellent speakers. It's about green infrastructure stewardship, making the most of what we've got, and it has quite an urban flavour, which is quite nice, I think, because there's so much opportunity for and there's so much importance and value in our urban green infrastructure. So we'll hear from two presenters that I will introduce, and then after each presentation there will be time for some Q&A. So please keep your questions coming through the presentations in the Q&A function, and we can pick those up in the third and final part of this morning's third session. So without further ado, I will introduce Ellie Robinson. Ellie has led the National Trust Strategic Programme and Partnership on Urban Green Space since 2016. She's worked with Drew Benelick at the National Lottery Heritage Funds to set up the Future Parks Accelerator. And as a sort of continuation of the excellent work of that accelerator, she's going to be talking about a new project called Nature Towns and Cities. Previously to this, Ellie was Assistant Director of External Affairs at the National Trust, which involved influencing decisions on environment and land use policy, funding and practice. So tons of experience to bring to this really exciting new project that the National Trust is running in partnership with a number of agencies. So look forward to hearing more from Ellie. Over to you, and warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Celia. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, great.
Yeah, thank you so much, TCPA and Green Infrastructure Partnership, for inviting us to share our sort of latest initiative with you. It's really good timing, but I should say before I start, I'm really here on behalf of National Lottery Heritage Fund and Natural England and the partners behind this initiative. It could have been any of us here today. We're really trying to pool our experience and the work of the last few years. So for Natural England, it's their green infrastructure framework and the standards and all the stuff that they will have been talking to you about over the last couple of years. And as Celia mentioned, for National Trust and for National Lottery Heritage Fund, this kind of really builds on all our learning from the Future Parks initiative and more. So can we start on the next slide, please? Thank you. So some of you will know a bit about this already. You will have been looking at the website and responding to the calls for expressions of interest. So I'll be brief in terms of summarising what it is, but I just want to explain a bit more about what it is we're trying to achieve, and hopefully for many of you as a sort of expert professional audience, it will seem really familiar. So what we're trying to do with Nature Towns and Cities is to really enable, build the capacity and get behind at least 100 towns and cities across the UK to help them sort of speed up and the work that they're doing to put nature, green space, green infrastructure at the heart of their communities for the health and well-being of residents, for the climate resilience of their place, for the investability of their place. And this isn't work that is new. This is work that we know is ongoing. I think what we're trying to do with Nature Towns and Cities is to really help lift the scale and the pace of that work, and particularly think about the sustainability of it and facing into the challenges around really squeezed capacity, really squeezed resources, but also really trying to reposition nature and natural infrastructure as a vital infrastructure for inclusive growth. These are topics running through your conference today and everything that the Green Infrastructure Partnership has been doing. But I think we're trying to set ourselves some challenging targets that are going to really incentivise and challenge us as founding partners, but particularly how we build a much wider group of support, funding, strategic partners, delivery partners. So it's not really about our three organisations, it's very much just trying to set a foundation really for the next decade. So some of our goals just to share with you, and it sort of speaks to some of our motivation here, really thinking about the impact of COVID and what we learned through that, but also the work that the Green Infrastructure work that Natural England's been doing, mapping current provision, and at a country level, Nature Scott, NRW and DERA, similar sort of data sets around, millions of people do not have access to nature and green space where they live. And it's a really significant scale of challenge. There's all sorts of reasons behind that. But I think for us, one of the key targets is about 5 million more people having access really close to home. And particularly, I think the children and young people audience is really important to us. So I think we were an additional sort of goal we're sort of sharing is 1 million more children being active on a regular basis, somewhere close to home, rich in nature, safe to play. And we're being broad and inclusive in our definition of green and blue space, as you would expect, but really thinking about places that are publicly accessible, street trees, community gardens, urban woods, historic parks, the whole broad sweep of green infrastructure. And there's some information already out there in the public domain on the Nature Towns and Cities website. I'll talk a little bit more because that's going to be porting to a bigger digital platform in the spring. Next slide, please. So I wouldn't normally share this slide. It's kind of our inner working program one, but for you as a sort of expert audience of thinkers and practitioners, I thought it'd just be useful because you will see your work reflected in this. As I said, we're taking a really broad definition, but we're using this to really look at baseline data that's going to monitor progress on a regular basis, and then in terms of 5 and 10-year progress goals. We're trying to use existing public data sets, not set up anything bespoke. But at the heart of it all is about people and people's access to green and blue spaces for their health and well-being. The second layer down is really thinking about the shift in how we think about green space, and particularly involving, engaging and enabling and empowering communities to be really at the heart of the change in their places. Historically, it sort of change is done to communities, so it's critical for green infrastructure going forward that we shift that. Pride in place is vital too. We saw that in the early work around levelling up. We don't want to lose that sort of sense of pride in place. We know is very much related to the quality of local lived environment. And at the bottom, there's a set of key outcomes measures which you will really recognise from all the work that you might be doing with either with TCPA on your day jobs or via the Green Infrastructure Partnership. There's a whole placemaking, nature recovery, climate resilience, and connectivity for active travel. So you can see it's kind of a comprehensive framework, but we feel it's really important to reflect different motivations places have for really having ambitions around their green infrastructure growth and change, and not to be too reductionist or narrow in how we define what it is to be a thriving nature town or a nature city. Next slide, please. So just kind of in a nutshell, we very much wanted this to be a UK initiative. It's really important to Heritage Fund as a UK funder, but also all the work we've done with towns and cities across the UK. There's lots of real similarities in terms of what the challenges and opportunities are. And in talking to places and to councils and to communities, they really wanted to feel part of a UK-wide sort of movement and a network, and to be sharing that experience and learning. So our targets really are we've got three key things we're sort of bringing out next year, which very much sort of link together. But we don't just want to start and stop there. We're very much in beta mode at the moment. I'm hoping some of you will have taken part in some of the events that have been going on, sort of in the early stages of us thinking about a network. But there's something really important about inspiring and enabling places to make progress, something actually that Green Infrastructure Partnership has done so much over the years. But we're trying to think about something that's a regular, weekly, ever-present sort of support and help for those that are working at the coalface, making change, trying to finance change, trying to forge partnerships for change. So we're building a network to inspire and enable share best practice, a source of training, a source of being able to spotlight fantastic practice and resources and tools, not just ones that we create, but ones that we think are fantastic that are out there already. We absolutely don't want to reinvent any wheels. There's there's a capacity building grant programme which went live in early October. We had an amazing response. There's over 270 EOIs that we received for and £170 million of capacity building grant request. We've only got a 15 million grant pot to invest, but we're absolutely thinking about how do we do justice to that real sense of interest and demand for change. So we are looking at how we can attract and build further capacity building support for next year. So we will be, we've got our work to do there, but absolutely something we're committed to. And the capacity building grant is very much a place partnerships, councils, community sector organisations, thinking about what is it that they really want to achieve and to invest in dedicated headspace capacity to drive forward that change. It's so hard to do on the edge of a busy desk. It's really hard to do if you don't have the space and the time to invest in really different partnerships, different operating models, a different sense of how you build your business cases, etc. And we've learned a lot from how we did Future Parks. So it's not sort of just a roll on of that sort of thing. It's very much trying to make it faster, easier, but also using that experience of cohort and peer support, which we know is so vital, both in terms of supporting local government, but also community sector partners as well. And then the accreditation scheme, something new. Natural England's leading on with our support. And we're thinking about this in terms of how do we recognise the progress that places make so that they are attractive for funders and investors. So how do we kind of reward, if you like, and showcase that and provide assurance to funders and investors that a place is ready for their money. So we're piloting this. We really want the early users of the accreditation to be feeding back, challenging, helping improve it. We're thinking about a foundation and an advanced level to reflect different stages of the journey that places might be at. And I think I'll come on to the timescales in a minute for next year, but I think this is something where we very much see it iterating. We obviously want feedback from funders and private, philanthropic, public sector funders. Does this work? Does it help? Does it give them real confidence that a place is ready to deliver real change? And in terms of pioneers, I'll just put this on in terms of we really wanted to catalyse much larger scale finance and funding for green infrastructure delivery. And to do that, we need a set of places that are really at an advanced level in the scale of finance that they can implement. So this is as much to challenge us to be helping a set of places. Ideally, it's 10, it's more than 5, but it's thinking about the maturity of that green infrastructure transformation planning and being very ready for delivery. So next slide, please. I'll just give you some examples of what I mean in a minute. So when we're thinking about 2035 and our set of goals, what would this look like on the ground, and how do we show that sort of tangible sense of change? So we just kind of picked out 4 key headlines where we're putting the targets in our own corporate plans, we're sharing them as a partnership, but we're also wanting to really build a sort of much wider collective of critical partners who might want to fund, partners who bring completely additional capability, partners who might want to be supporting delivery at a regional or a country level. So we're sort of really the reason we've brought out the initiative as a beta is to actually bring loads of other organisations around this to help us build it, to shape it, and to make it really work for the different parts of the UK. Not everywhere is going to need exactly the same, and we want to be really sensitive to that, and sensitive also to the activity and the fantastic work that's already out there. If great networks exist, brilliant, we'll build on those. If there's energy and ideas that are where other critical parts of the sector are playing a leading role, that's fantastic. We'll kind of want to boost that. So we absolutely don't want to replicate anything. If there's also amazing resources and tools that have been produced, we'll want to signpost to those. So one of the critical goals we've set is about 1,000 existing green or blue spaces being improved for people, nature and heritage. Kind of really obvious, but just to give you an example, in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, the foundation, the philanthropic foundation and the council have been working together for the last few years around really transforming kind of neglected community parks and green spaces. They've got their Green Heart Parks, but it's been a really interesting way of bringing the voluntary sector and local government sector together at a strategic level, but to really get to mobilising local community support, energy ideas to transform those slightly unloved, unused spaces and making them very much at the heart of the community. And in BCP, they've been bringing back cafes that are shut, programs of activity, health and wellbeing activities, activities for children, all sorts of sort of the animation and the kind of community love of a green space. So you'll have loads of examples, I'm sure, that you have either worked on or familiar with in the areas that you're working. Next slide, please. The key goal is 1,000 new smaller scale green spaces in neighbourhoods that are really lacking access to any provision of nature or green space. So this might be, as I said earlier, street trees, it might be taking spaces that aren't really safe and accessible and turning them around with but it's very much that kind of community leadership and the community activation of spaces. So I've got a couple of examples. There's Alfred Place Gardens in Camden, which was a street, lots of parking, and it's been turned into kind of a new street park. There's lots of examples of smaller spaces, pocket parks, but these are really important in areas that are lacking natural spaces to kind of give that sense of nature on the doorstep. And we know there's loads of great work across the country. So, but this is very much kind of trying to scale up and come up with tools that make that a lot easier and actually knocking barriers out the way. Next slide, please. Our third kind of big goal is community empowerment for taking action for nature and climate. There's lots of great stuff happening. The Wildlife Trust has done loads of really brilliant work on this. Just a couple of examples that we're supporting at the minute. There's the Nature Neighbourhoods Initiative and Mathworth Theatre in Leeds. Brilliant kind of gardening group. Another example is Islington's Greener Together community partnerships and working with schools, parents in green spaces outside schools. So there's a absolute load of fantastic examples, but how can we bring that learning together and how can we actually enable another 1,000 spaces to be created? So obviously this is not about us doing this directly, it's absolutely about empowering and getting behind community organisations, voluntary partners and councils who are already doing bits and pieces of work but it's about making this an at-scale solution. Next slide, please. And our final one is about 100 major new green spaces or parks. You'll be familiar with lots happening in the country, but that sense of really injecting, it's a catalyst for much wider change across the network of green and blue spaces. But it is important, and this is an example of Derriford Community Park in Plymouth, where they were joining 3 disparate bits of green spaces that weren't publicly accessible, created a new community park, Pool Farms at the heart of it, but it's very much like a 21st century park. Brilliant for nature recovery, brilliant for climate resilience and slowing the flow of water into the city. But first and foremost, it's a space for children and young people to be connecting with nature. And it's just set up in a way that is very different. I think you'll have examples of city centre parks. There's a fantastic example from Nottingham. There'll be regional parks. But it's really important for that sense of ambition. And once you're looking at creating a new park, it helps just bring to life what this really means in a way that's tangible for the rest of the place. So these are by no means exhaustive targets. We have sort of other targets that are about mobilising £1 billion to invest in green infrastructure delivery over the next decade, and others about how we nurture leadership across places and teams who are working on this. So we will be sharing much more of this next year as we build the initiative out. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. So just to give you a heads up on the timeline, as I said, we're in beta mode. We've got the expressions of interest for the grant out. The next milestone for us is the accreditation going live in January. As I said earlier, it's very much about getting the early users of the accreditation system to really help us test it and improve it and iterate it so that it does really work for what it's intending to do. It's not supposed to be like a regulatory driver or something that's really difficult to reach or a hoop that's so high to jump over. It's absolutely about rewarding progress. And at the heart of it all is very much green infrastructure strategies, green infrastructure improvement plans, the things that all of you would be really familiar with, but very much trying to sort of spotlight and help places to get to that level of readiness. The spring, we will have the network going live. So this we've got a holding website at the minute, and hopefully some of you have been taking part in the webinars over the autumn. We will continue with that series into the early new year, but very much from spring we'll have a new big digital capability to make joint working, bringing us all together, doing training sessions, cohort work, learning, regular weekly activity online to bring us all together. That will be ready from late spring. But what we would love to do is to really gain your, as a expert audience, an audience that's working on this day in, day out. For many of you, I'm sure, really source your wisdom and your experience about what is it that you really think places need in terms of support. What are the sources of inspiration that you see out there? If you were going to be spotlighting examples of fantastic practice across the UK, we really want to be bringing that together and to showcasing that, because it's the sort of things that really help others feel a sense of what's possible. And thirdly, I think, are there tools, are there approaches, are there products that you use or you see others using that you would be recommending? So we'd love to have a session with TCPA members and Green Infrastructure Partner members in the spring, but we can come back to that with Julia and the team to try and organise something that fits in with the timescale. And then we're heading towards a public launch at the end of July, and that's so far we've not really said anything publicly about this initiative. We've been very much speaking to councils, to community sector partners, to experts in the sector that you all work in. But from July onwards, we'll be announcing the grantees and a set of other key things for the initiative, and having a more public presence from the second half of the year. And then in the autumn, really wanting to move on to the community leadership around community greening, what's working in terms of empowerment, what we're learning, what support does the community sector need to really play a vitally important role. So we've been touching on it, but I think for the second half of the year, we want to really shift the focus to embracing the leaders in that sector and working with key community sector partners outside of the typical green sector to learn from what's worked in other areas of social policy delivery and community sector led change. And we will be hopefully announcing the first accredited towns and cities and holding events with funders and investors with those places to help showcase their readiness for money. I think I'm at time, Celia, so I'm going to stop there, and yeah, I can take questions afterwards, and then there's our contacts which we can share so that you can follow up if you've got any specific things that you want to ask us. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie, for giving that really helpful overview of nature towns and cities. I think it's so exciting to see a project coming forward with such credible partners leading it, but also such a scale of ambition. And I think the case studies that you shared were really powerful. The slide on the BCP parks just really demonstrates how many benefits there are to be gained from investing in urban green infrastructure. So thanks so much. I can see that some questions are coming through in the Q&A, and we'll come to them after the next presenter. So please do stick around so we can address those in the panel. So without further ado, I shall move on to Jim Davis, who is a planning professional with 20 years experience for a range of backgrounds and interests, including minerals and waste, regional planning. He's now focusing on climate change. He's worked with the Environment Agency and Sustainability West Midlands on the West Midlands Climate Change Risk Assessment and Adaptation Plan, which is a really fantastic resource. I really recommend people look at that if they're interested in climate resilience. And he's now focusing on promoting the role of the Environment Agency in supporting green growth by enhancing the environment and building resilient places. So the focus is now in the National Sustainable Places team on the emerging local nature recovery strategies. So we had a session earlier focusing on biodiversity net gain, and I think local nature recovery strategies, this other area of practice that's coming forward and being embedded now that's really has significant potential to benefit nature. So over to you, Jim. We look forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yep, good. That's quite a big intro. I'll have to try and live up to that now. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about local nature recovery strategies and how I see them, or yeah, I see them personally fitting in with the urban regeneration and sort of green infrastructure in towns and cities agenda. So this will be a bit death by PowerPoint to end the day on, but it hopefully will bring a lot of what's been talked about today to life. That's the grandiose plan, to weave a lot of what was already been discussed already into this final presentation. Next slide, please. So just to start off with, local nature recoveries are locally led evidence-based strategies to sort of prioritise nature investment and priority areas for nature improvement. Urban green and blue infrastructure, this is taken from Climate Adapt EU definition, a strategic approach to develop interconnected and multifunctional networks of blue and green spaces. We're in the same space now, literally, LNRS and green and blue infrastructure. So I thought I'd start off with that. We are looking at the same thing. Hopefully that strategic approach to nature, that a strategic approach to nature recovery, and then linking in with development and those wider socio-economic benefits that come out of this. Next slide, please. So LNRS is, as I've just said, a spatial strategies created under the Environment Act 2021, full England coverage. They are the sort of delivery arm of the nature recovery network. Hopefully they will all align. They are to target the improved nature and provide other environmental benefits. So you look at habitat and species driven, but a big component where the Environment Agency and myself come in a little bit more on those wider environmental benefits. And then you've got the wider socio-economic benefits that come from that. So for us, away from the habitats and species, there's flood and integrated water management, but again, using your habitats and using your species to sort of drive that, to create nature-rich spaces, tackle the health and well-being crisis that are going on, and then to create climate resilience in landscapes, catchments and urban areas. There are 48 of them, as has been previously mentioned. The responsible authorities are the sort of county councils or combined authorities, that upper tier. The supporting authorities or districts and sometimes the Mets in those urban areas have a key role in supporting the delivery. And Natural England are sort of the heavy lifting on this. They sort of work hand in glove with the responsible authorities to get these things created. Gets a little level of conformity in there, but they are locally driven. A bit of consistency coming through, and to help and to provide that sort of delivery arm of the LNRS. Where other partners will be involved, and myself at the agency and Forestry Commission with sort of arm's length bodies. We're not technically supporting authorities, but we do provide that sort of evidence and support to these things going through. So they are cross-cutting in how many partners will be drawn in. Next slide, please. So just a bit of someone asked about the recovery guidance. There it is. It's been published. I did put a link in, but I can always circulate it. The guidance has been out. It's developed, from DEFRA with Natural EA and FC sort of supporting that sort of guidance. And each LNRS will agree priorities for nature recovery, map the most valuable existing areas for nature it already has in those areas, and then map specific proposals for creating and improving habitat for nature and wider environmental goals. Taking what you've got, building on it, and then hopefully connecting it all up, agreeing the priorities and measures that come with that. They will dovetail into the planning system as hopefully guidance is forthcoming from MHCLG on how exactly LNRS will be taken into account into the planning system. It is in the MPPF. And they are designed to dovetail into the planning system to support local plans, to sort local decision making, and then link into maybe economic strategies as well. So I'm completely sold on them. The enthusiasm hopefully comes over. Others may differ, but so hopefully they're looking to be published from March onwards. We have one already in the west of England that's been published, a few others are at pre-publication stage, and then we'll start to see in the new year a lot more start to come through. And I've got a couple of examples later on and sort of try and bring this to life. And then depending on the government, they will be reviewed 3 to 10 years. So they sort of evolve as we go forwards. Next slide, please. So just a very, very quick sort of flow chart of how they work. 5 steps. Step 1 is map what you've already got. Loads of data out there already with the county councils and others. The BAPs provide loads of information, green infrastructure strategy, it's all out there. So step one, map everything you've got already. Step two, it was to review what you've already done in LRS, but this is the first wave, so skip over step two. Step three is quite key, and it's provision of evidence and data, and looking at the strategy area, making a sort of statement about it. What's your pressures? What's your environmental opportunities? What are the sort of pressures in your area? I'll come to that later. Step four is then look at all the pressures and opportunities, and then agree priorities and potential measures as you go forwards, where to go, and then what to target, what to prioritize. And step five is the map, where those priorities are mapped on. So it will all come to life with the map there. So then as they go through to pre-publication with the public consultation, Natural England will then have the sort of, will then work with them at the final stage to be signed off and then published. So as we say, one's gone through already, others are slowly starting to come through. Next slide, please. So step three, you map what you've already got, identify your priorities for habitats and species out there, and then you add in everything else that's going on. For us, flood risk, big key, water shortage, water abstraction, over abstraction in some areas, all these pressures, coastal erosion, nutrient management, overgrazing, intensive agriculture, urban and rural settings. All these factors start to be thrown into step three to help you sort of work out what your priorities and what your measures will be. Climate change overarches everything, in my opinion. LNRS are climate adaptation documents because you have to take into account the changing climate, how your nature recovery will fit into that climate change agenda, and how in 30 years climate change will impact on what you're trying to recreate. So LNS have to be they are adaptation strategies, and they have to take into account what the temperature and what the scenarios will be 20, 30, 40 years in the future. Next slide, please. Step four, just sort of look at the priorities, and they should reflect local circumstances. And an example would be pertains to manage flood risk. This address local habitat loss, and there's sort of specific species identification, which ones they really want to target in that LNRS. It is using nature-based solutions in those urban and rural environments, which then leads on to where the agency can get some support from and get some delivery on flood risk and water management. And those potential measures will be the actual specific things happening. So that could be encouraging tree planting, urban or rural, creating wildflower meadows, and restoring rivers. And that could be restoring urban rivers or rural rivers high up in the catchment. So that's where that's the nuts and bolts come out at stage four, the priorities and the potential measures. Next slide, please. And then you get a map, hopefully, and it might look something like this on the left. You've got green circles are areas of particular importance for the biodiversity that already exist. The blue line, I'm going to say, is a river, because I've used this for quality restoration talk, trying to take a catchment approach. And those red blobs and red and brown blobs are areas that could become, they're the ones that could become have a potential to be important for biodiversity. That could drive what you do and where you do it. And they'll be mapped in the LNRS, and that comes with a certain BNG uplift on credits. And then you start to, with the map, hopefully you then build on the Lawton principles, as previously mentioned, getting that connectivity, targeting your habitats in the right place. And LNRS hopefully will be the strategic approach, rather than piecemeal. Landowner A wants to do tree planting, landowner B wants to do something else. LNRS could sit over the top and try and organise which strategy or which site could do best, and timing, and try and get that sort of joined up approach to timing, funding streams, funding mechanisms, and land use, and hopefully will fit into any emerging land use framework that starts to come out. And then with a map, it fits lovely with a local plan, and all the maps start to align, hopefully, and then you've got housing and development, road building, infrastructure. Then your LNRS is starting to sort of support those at the earliest stage of your master planning and local plan emerging. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'll go quick. And if we're talking about catchment scale and then joining up different policies and different strategies, just a very quick example. On the left is the water plan for England, with a map of what we're going to do to help water abstraction and water quality in England. And on the right is the Environment Agency's and sort of DEFRA's National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, with a diagram of what we're going to do on the catchment. The same things are going on. for flood risk, for water quality, for water resources, catchment, urban, rural, in those areas. So that's the way LNRS hopefully will start to weave. This is an example. Weave common measures in. So if you're doing something for flood risk, it could have a load more benefits for water quality, biodiversity, maybe land use, maybe help suck up nutrients, support that nutrient neutrality approach, and then enable economic growth, and then build in your more social elements, which are sort of probably more poignant in urban areas. But a lot LNRS will hopefully line up lots of multiple strategies. This is just an example of one case. Next slide, please. And just to sort of bring that to life, I know it's a rural environment, but this is sort of putting the wiggle back in the River Eden in the Lake District, natural river processes, holding up floodwater further down the catchment, in the urban areas which are further down, coupled with tree planting, coupled with other measures, environmental measures, habitats and species improving, but we're getting a big sort of flood risk and water quality benefit and wider benefits of the economic and social sort of further downstream. That's just a quick example of that. Next slide, please. So how would that look if you were looking at an LNRS? So natural floodplain management, which we've just seen, step 3 would be you've got a flood risk problem in your area. The picture below is Bewdley in Worcestershire, and it floods several times a year now. Step 4 is, so you identify flood risk is going on. Step 4, you say that flood risk is the priority for our area, or one of the priorities, and we're going to take a sort of natural management approach to that, coupled with maybe some engineering. But for the LNRS point of view, we're going to do some sort of natural floodplain management, and that's the priority in step 4. And step 5 is when you hopefully try to sort of translate that to maps, which areas can be for woodland planting, for that drive, for that water management, where those leaky dams going to go in, how will that land use impact? So bring it up, step 3, step 4, step 5. That's how natural floodplain management could fit into an LNRS. Next slide, please. And then bringing it to the urban area, we know that from our work on climate change, that the most deprived areas in urban areas will be hit hardest by climate change. They are the most vulnerable to it, and they are the most least resistant. They're also the most green deprived. So, that when you're looking at this is some from the West Midlands work going on at the moment with the Combined Authority and Birmingham University, and you start to look at, you map where your areas of high urban deprivation are. You map areas with high risk of air quality, poor access to nature, and it tends to be those deprived areas again. So the solution, or one of the solutions, will be green investment in green infrastructure in those deprived communities as part of regeneration schemes, as part of infrastructure. So you're tackling urban heat, localized flood risk, and making it a better place to live. LNRS can fit into this. Next slide, please. And just some examples of what's already happening. This River Quaggy, big restoration scheme going on down there. Used a park, put the wiggle back in. Some urban rivers, heavily modified, not looking great in most areas. Birmingham, Stoke, Sheffield, London, very urbanized, built over, hidden away, flood risk, terrible quality. River Quaggy's come along strategy and tried to open them up where possible. You can't restore them back to sort of pristine condition in all places, but you can try and do things where you can in those tight urban environments. Put a little bit of gravel in, put a bit of planting in, soften it up, coupled with maybe bigger structures and hollows and wiggles in parks where it's available. Next slide, please. Other example, one I was involved with very, very slightly, was the brownfield regeneration of the Victoria Ground in Stoke. Moved the River Trent, moved it to one side, put a wiggle in it, improved it vastly for its quality, enabled a bigger housing development to go in, or better design, because you sort of shifted it, and St Modwin's had a better space to go at. Plus, you improved the environment. You cleaned up a brownfield site. You've used nature. You've worked with nature, and you've made sort of a big improvement to quite a site that was derelict for 20 years. And then you're sort of fitting into you've got a green park and green space within 15 minutes. So you're building up your environmental objective targets as well. Next slide, please. I was speaking briefly for the Forestry Commission, who are involved. tree planting as well, tree planting on a big scale in Kielder Forest up in Northumberland, and then working with nature in Leicester, you know, in parks, this Sense Park, putting trees in, you know, community benefits on that. And then we've got Birmingham Urban Forest Master Plan, putting the trees in Birmingham because of the benefits they provide. So again, where do you want to plant trees? Where's the best place to plant trees? What type of trees can all feature into that LNRS, linking up with other issues as well. Next slide, please. River Cole again. River Cole in Birmingham, restoring the river to its original line. Next to a sort of community, access to the community, they can now see the river, they can access the river, and it's a nature-based solution towards that in an urban area. Next slide, please. Charging to the end now. Close to my house, we're opening up the River Sherborne, goes into, it disappears into Coventry City Centre, it goes under it, but just outside we've got a lot of work going on in one of the local parks and some urban regeneration just off the ring road to really sort of enhance the River Sherborne for biodiversity, for public access, but it will have a flood risk component and reduce flood risk to Coventry and the wider catchment. So this is work that's already happening and can be enhanced with LNRS sort of supporting it and backing it up. Next slide, please. So how would that work in an LRS? So for climate resilience, you know, step 3, you target urban waterways. They are a problem for flood risk and poor quality. Step 4, they are your top priority. You build them into the LNRS to target them, and then step 5, you map the areas where that could happen. So identify, prioritize, and then map them with the areas. Step 4, next slide, please. Just very quickly, you can use the public health element on this as well. Same sort of principles, putting green space into those urban areas. Step 3 is lack of green space in this town, Birmingham, I think on the photograph. How can you use urban regeneration to green it? It's a priority. You know, you can put green space in, urban trees, multifunctional green space, greening factor, and then again at step 5, you start to map those areas. Next slide, hopefully bringing this to life a little bit. LNRS out for consultation in Manchester has mapped the deprived areas and then the areas of green space and the areas that could have green space. And there is sort of correlation now to the potential areas for biodiversity and habitat improvement will be some of those deprived areas, making that link clear. Next slide, please. Northants out for public consultation as well. Priorities in their urban environments, restoring natural rivers, improving green space, it's their urban priority. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that there's a map there of their potential areas in green. That's where the areas they want to go and improve, potential to improve that nature and biodiversity. And where you apply priority RF43, which was the urban green space, then you sort of can click on there if you go on it, and it tells you why an area has been designated RF43 and RF42, those specific urban priorities. If you go on to the next slide, hopefully, that will show, this is a map I've sort of cobbled together showing some deprived part of Corby, in Northants, and then for the same space you look at what they've allocated for green space improvement in the LNRS. They start to correlate. In this case they do pretty much. So you're looking at urban regeneration with an LNRS targeting that area for green improvement. Potentially the BNG link is there, but making that link clear that LNRS can guide and can support urban regeneration in those deprived areas. Next slide, please, which I think is the summary. Yeah, so LNRS and urban GI are strategic plans for nature. They are doing the same job, hopefully. They're both creating adaptive and resilient places. LNRS provides a platform for those wider environmental benefits, the flood risk, the tackling urban heat effect, all those issues. Is a platform for BNG potentially around brownfield regeneration. And LNRS should link to housing and regeneration strategies. So if you green somewhere, it tends to go up in value, it tends to improve, then you've got a sort of potential green gentrification going on. So has to be linked with other strategies within councils and housing and socio-economic. And that is a whistle stop tour. Thank you very much. And on time, I think.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jim, so much. That was a huge amount of content to get through, but I think really helpful to give an overview of the real potential power of local nature recovery strategies, just to, like you say, bringing different levers from different strategies together in one place and supporting wider objectives around green infrastructure and nature recovery. So fantastic. So I'll invite Ellie to turn her camera on. Hopefully she's still there. I've seen that there's lots of questions coming through, some of which have been answered. Some of the more procedural questions about the kind of funding opportunities and local nature recovery strategies I think have been dealt with. So I'm going to take Chair's prerogative because the headline for the session today was about stewardship. So I'd like to ask both of you in turn about how nature towns and cities and local nature recovery strategies can really support long-term stewardship of green infrastructure. And I'll go to you, Ellie, for some reflections.
Thanks, Celia. Yeah, I think that's a big question, isn't it? I think stewardship's absolutely at the heart of what we want to support places to do. But I think it's probably helping places move on from an old model of stewardship to some new ones, not a singular new one, but lots of different approaches where they are thinking about stewardship with partners, not just a micro community scale, but other critical partners across a place. They're thinking about the value creation of those spaces and how stewardship, you're stewarding a space to deliver different sorts of services for places, not just the old ones from the important as they are, but recreation from parks, as Jim's just been brilliantly illustrating through loads of examples. There's so many other services that spaces can provide. And some of those services attract outcomes payments or capital payments to upgrade spaces so that they can help with slowing the flow, or there's myriad opportunities to help places deliver a lot more value and a lot more benefit. So part of Nature Towns and Cities is helping councils and their partners think through, reimagining and revisioning what spaces provide, not on their own, but also as a network, and where they want to enhance that network. And so the stewardship model for that network will have to look quite different. And the other critical factor is about that blended funding model. So what I should have said earlier, whether you get a grant or not as a place, you still have access to all of the free resources, the peer support, as part of the network. So that's going to be a really critical part of learning and sharing how to steward differently. And different places have got opportunities that they can grab that others don't. But I think that's the mix of and diversity of experience is going to be critical to helping fast track what some of those new stewardship models look like.
Great, yes, so many places facing the same challenges. So I think that toolkit and resources and sharing that is really important. Jim, your thoughts on local nature recovery strategies and long-term stewardship, how can they support?
Yeah, if you're providing a space for nature that's got a multifunctional benefit, it's providing a service, therefore it should be maintained by whoever's benefiting from that. That's quite simplistic, but if it's a subsystem, then you'd hope that that subsystem will be maintained because it's providing a flood risk. If it's providing active green space, it could be adopted as a park. If it's providing access to green space that's got a health benefit. There are funding potential around, NH green prescribing. You can't green prescribe if there's no green spaces to go to. So there's potential there for fund to wider, as Ellie says, for wider people to be involved with. But because these green spaces provide a service, they shouldn't be neglected. And their value is clear. So and they're part of a network, as a strategic network. So you can't just let one bit decline. The political drive behind it to maintain them is there, but it makes economic and social sense to do so. Not just save the particular species. Now because we've got public health crisis. What poor old butterfly, but if that butterfly is living on a site that's providing so much more for the community, that site will be maintained and will last, hopefully.
Yep, great. I think that's a key part of the nature recovery strategies, raising the profile of those opportunities, isn't it? So there was a question that came through about to what extent growing places, community growing, community farms can be considered as an integral part of the green infrastructure network. And I think that's really interesting, because I think from Ellie, your presentation was really focused about people and how green infrastructure really benefits people, and local nature recovery strategies have potentially more of a focus on nature. So there are some opportunities to bring those things really together. So what are your views on the role of community growing spaces and how they can be enhanced and supported? I'll go to Ellie first again.
Thanks, Neal. This is a really good question. I one of my examples was Mathwa Theatre in Leeds, and they use community growing as a means to connect people to nature and natural spaces. And we're working on this initiative with WWF and RSPB that kind of grew out of the People's Plan for Nature, and kind of a community neighbourhood version of that, where we're investing in small scale charities and voluntary sector organisations to lead the community mobilisation of what do they want, what's their desire for their place. And so many of them have got community growing as part of it. And I think so it's a really important part of responding to what communities want and need. So I think it's absolutely vital part of that. I mean, in the old world, it would have been a set of allotments, but I think there's a much greater diversity of interventions that support community growing. And there's also the therapeutic benefits, which I think, it's been incredibly challenging for therapeutic farms and to survive the last few years in terms of the resource constraints and the lack of funding to pay for their services. But I think the focus on the health mission in government and the shift back to prevention and a much greater evidence base now of how farms can really work, particularly for young people who are excluded from school or struggling with attendance. So for mental health and well-being of young people in particular. So I think they might have their time in the spotlight again, but hopefully with an enhanced way of supporting the value that they bring. And I think it goes back to what Jim was saying earlier, whether it's a food growing space, whether it's a space that's brilliant for nature, whether it's a space that's brilliant for communities, they're all going to need to draw on the multifunctional benefit to secure the resources to fund them long term. And I think that's also true of food growing spaces. So yeah, I think they're really important, and there's definitely a groundswell of interest, but whether it's how those spaces are sustained, I think is very much down to the communities that are leading that change. I don't see yet a systemic way of supporting that. So I think it's something that we want to help those community groups look at.
Yeah, that's it's good. I like your optimism about the kind of potential sort of shift in direction around health prevention and that being supportive. Jim, do you have anything to add from an LRS perspective?
Yeah, just very quickly, green spaces for community, they might not have jump off the page as nature driven, but they could be part of the nature network and provide valuable green space, multifunctional green space. But what they will do, and what we did find when we did the climate change work in the West Midlands, those allotments and community spaces will connect communities that probably don't even know the environment's out there. They will get them out the doors. They will provide green spaces and get them an interest in the environment in a small way that maybe build. So when someone comes along talking about LRS, what does that mean to me? You've got that awareness of green space and what it can do is starting to grow. It came on the back of COVID. People wanted to go and walk. They could only walk for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. They needed local green space, whether that churchyard, whether that be a little bit of river. So these community gardens, I think, raise awareness and get community engagement and local support, which you then can tap into for wider into other things as well.
Great.
And it makes the connection to food as well, which probably has gone amiss lately. I think they got making the connection, I think was a drive. Yeah, so it doesn't come from supermarkets originally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so many climate related factors feed into that, don't they, about air miles and reducing and growing locally. So yes, I'm going to finish on a question which is I think you've sort of touched on it in the answer slightly, but it's about kind of the role of communities. I think there's so much energy, appetite in communities to see their local neighbourhoods, their immediate environments greened. how can they play a role in the nature towns and cities in working with their local authorities, and how can they play a role in shaping the local nature recovery strategy, or seeing their aspirations at a community level realised through that strategy? So I'll go to you first, Jim, this time.
Yeah, LNRS is supposed to be locally driven up. About the guidance and the national is all there, the infrastructure at the top, but they're supposed to be locally driven. So a lot of the engagement for LNRS has been with the farming community, land users, because they've got the big estates out in the rural areas. But there's got to be a community. I know West Midlands Combined Authority and Manchester have gone into those communities to sometimes they don't think the environment's important to them in these big, these deprived communities. So LNRS has to go in and explain why, and if it can use something else. We had recent flood events. We had some in Spark Hill in Birmingham, Sparkbrook, a few years ago, quite a deprived community. On the work we did was with surface water flooding. But if an area is affected by that, or high poor air quality, then you can use something to go in on and make it real for that community who may not notice you're there. But it's a tough ask in some areas. We're not, the environment isn't up there. But when you clean up the local parks, when you come along with an NRS strategy as part of sort of a combined effort around the value of the environment and green space for all the other public health and transport and all the other benefits, then you'll get some traction. But LNRS needs to have that community engagement. And the North Northants map I've showed, it's got lots of tiny little sites. So there's a lot of community level designations, which you would assume there's been a lot of community engagement, or something real on a map. There's a green blob in your community. Generate.
Yeah,
I'll pass to Ellie very quickly on that now.
Over to you, Ellie.
Thanks. I think I completely agree with Jim. I think that bottom-up expression of what is vital, whether it's an LNRS or a green infrastructure strategy. So as part of the toolkit of supporting places to do, brilliant green infrastructure strategies that have got real engagement and buy-in of local residents, businesses, institutions like schools, we'll be looking at sort of toolkits that help them do that. So that's one key thing, is building communities right into the process from the start, so that their needs and desires and ideas form a critical part of what becomes a GI improvement plan. But I think this is one of the really challenging areas, is to how do you help communities influence and then sustain engagement at a scale. I think there's quite a lot of support out there for an individual little small space, but that takes a huge amount of effort from a community. How do they navigate the council systems? How does a council think about a proportionate agreement with a small community group that isn't really burdensome and bureaucratic? So one of the things we're going to be looking at in 2025 is looking at it from both ends of the spectrum or the telescope, and helping community sector organisations work with their councils and vice versa, and thinking about what are the toolkits, are there template agreements, are there things that make it easy in terms of insurance for local groups, and how do we knock a lot of those barriers out the way. So one of the reasons for the Nature Neighbourhoods initiative that I mentioned earlier, that's supported by the Community Fund and the Co-op, was to help us learn from 18 community groups trying to do this, and having that sense of scaling their activities in a place with other community groups. So it's a challenge, but also I can see there's a lot of opportunities to get some of the basics right. So as I said, second half this year, we really want to make sure we're investing a lot of effort, listening to what works already, spotlighting fantastic practice, pulling out toolkits, and then putting on training, because I think some of this is about skills and understanding, particularly in the council. It's really hard if you're under a huge amount of pressure, you don't have enough capacity in teams. So how can we help councils come up with a system that makes it super easy for community groups to interact with them? But yeah, I'm not pretending this is going to be easy, but it is a really important area, and a big focus for us second half of next year. If that helps.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. I think the key message there is invest in the community engagement to shape your plans and strategies, because that will make them more robust, and also take advantage of the learning from other areas that have been able to do it well, both from the authority and community level. So thanks so much. It's dead on 12 o'clock, so that just leaves me to wrap up the conference today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and all our presenters for a really fantastic, engaging session. Thanks to the team at the TCPA for organising this session and our sponsors of the Green Infrastructure Partnership. We will be following up with an email out to all participants to share the recording and slides from today's panellists, and we hope you have enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.